The bells of the convent tolled for the last time. High in the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees shivered in the autumn wind, a small band of nuns gathered inside their fading chapel. They prayed beneath cracked frescoes. Saints with faces long scraped away by age and sorrow. On the horizon, fire shimmered. Ottoman banners were already visible. Red cloth fluttering like sparks across the mountains. The women knew exactly what that meant. No riders came from the nearby towns. No soldiers remained to guard them, only the stillness before conquest. Their abbeys, Sister Eleni of Lissa, stood before the altar holding a silver crucifix that had survived a century of storms, she whispered. If they breach our walls, keep your vows inside your hearts that they cannot take. But she was wrong. When the empire's armies reached the convent gates, vows, prayers, and sanctity meant nothing against what history tried to erase. If you're drawn to documented records from the Ottoman-Byzantine frontiers, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more of the accounts buried in archives, from missionary letters to Vatican reports. Now, back to the story. The first stones of the convent collapsed before sundown. The hymns that once filled those halls were drowned out by iron and screams. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent wasn't sacred ground. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that the cross still dared to rise in conquered soil. Inside the sisters hid their relics, silver chalices, embroidered icons, fragments of saint bones beneath the chapel floor. They believed if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. But the soldiers weren't after treasure. They wanted evidence proof that they had crushed not just the enemy's armies, but their God. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were herded into the courtyard. Torchlight turned their white robes into shifting gold and shadow. They were told they'd be taken before the Pashur, a promise few ever lived to see fulfilled. What followed became legend, so grim that even church chroniclers avoided the details. By dawn, the convent was ash. Smoke drifted from the refectory where the women once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags fluttered from the bell tower, signaling nearby units that resistance was over. Yet in that courtyard, something unexpected happened. The soldiers waiting for screams heard singing instead. Bound with rope, the surviving sisters began to chant a hymn not of despair but defiance. The Agnus Dei, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices trembled but never broke. The Ottoman captain, unsure whether to laugh or silence them, ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross rescued from the altar. The captain promised her mercy. If she renounced her God and accepted the conqueror's faith, her sisters would live. Her reply sealed her fate. I have already given my life. What else can you take? The captain hesitated, perhaps moved, then turned away, leaving her to his men. What followed was never written in full. Even Ottoman records which glorified victory described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. Yet in later European letters, her name resurfaced. Eleni of Lissa, the nun who would not kneel. By midday, the convent's bells were melted for coin, and the rooftop cross shipped east as a trophy. But soon, rumors spread across nearby villages. They said that when the wind swept through the ruins at night, one could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely faded when the march began. What remained of the order? 22 women in torn habits were driven south toward the coast, ankles bound, watched by Ottoman horsemen to the empire. They weren't prisoners of war, but symbols of conquest, proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was merciless. The sun scorched the road. The sisters, who had never stepped beyond their cloister, stumbled from thirst and exhaustion. When one fell, another lifted her veil so soldiers wouldn't trample it. A final act of dignity in a world stripped of mercy. Their Abbas was gone, but her last words endured among them. If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other. After 7 days of walking, the captives reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman GS, ships designed not for comfort, but for control. The women were herded aboard, wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves once rode. As the sails caught the wind, the shores of Greece faded into the horizon, and with them everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Isef Ager, kept meticulous records: cargo, spices, coins, textiles, and religious captives. It was this very ledger, discovered centuries later in the archives of Istanbul, that confirmed a story once dismissed as legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms lashed the deck. Salt stung their wounds. Hunger hollowed their faces. Yet what broke them most wasn't pain. It was silence. No one spoke to them except to bark commands. They existed like ghosts floating between sky and sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the crashing waves. But even the chained prisoners around her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea seemed to still. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them, its domes and minarets glowing like blades in the dawn. Across the strait, the city seemed alive, breathing with power. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, it would become their cage. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Locals paused to stare. Christian nuns among captives were a rarity. Even in an empire built on conquest, they were led past the ancient walls of Blackany toward the imperial district where their fates would be sealed. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the once great cathedral of Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzins' calls echoed from the minuets, one of the sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns. This was not a dungeon. It was the Dan Humayun, the imperial council, where the will of the Sultan ruled above all. Here, captives were not judged by kings or priests, but by empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their faith would be measured against the laws of conquest. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, a man whose expression betrayed nothing. To his left, scribes waited with ink and parchment, ready to record every detail, names, ages, and intended uses. Every word would be entered into registers that still survive centuries later, stained by wax and time. The sisters stood in torn habits, eyes lowered. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy on one condition. Those who accepted conversion would be given new names, food, and life within the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean imprisonment or disappearance. None spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled. She had seen what happened to other captives brought before the vizier. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Diris, stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay. "My lord," she said, "you may rename us, but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate such words. When he did, the vizier's face remained unreadable. Then he replied coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a motion of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would call it mercy. Others would later call it something far worse. Some were given a different kind of prison, one disguised as service. Beneath the palace gardens lay a labyrinth of stone halls sealed from the sun. Each chamber had a thin slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were strict of their habits, clothed in rough garments, and told they would now serve cleaning floors, sewing garments, feeding fires for the upper chambers. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude. But the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger, cold, and solitude were nothing new. For them, suffering was not punishment. It was devotion made real. Even in this subterranean prison, their discipline became armor. At night, they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed. They began counting days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call, not out of conversion, but as a defiant clock for faith that refused to die. Soon whispers spread among the servants. There were stories of the silent sisters, foreign women buried beneath the palace who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed, others called them saints. Their silence echoed through the tunnels louder than prayer. Days bled into months. Their hands blistered from labor, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that gave heat to others, but none to them. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed time and hunger would bend even the strongest faith. That was when the next stage began, a test disguised as mercy. First came kindness. Food, oil, and silks were sent to their quarters. Learned men from the palace came to speak gently, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. Your God and ours are not enemies. One imam said, "Take our tongue and you will be free." But they all understood what that freedom meant, erasing the memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and trembling, began to rise as their strength. She whispered fragments of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept them alive. Even incomplete, the word endured. When persuasion failed, the masks came off. The torches were doused. Food cut in half. No more kind visits, only silence and darkness. One by one, they were taken to a narrow room where scribes waited. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused disappeared. It wasn't one grand act of cruelty, but a slow, methodical breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away by hunger, waiting, and the quiet voice asking, "Why suffer for a God who doesn't answer?" A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who remained, each disappearance hardened their resolve. Sister Dearest, once brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. "Call me Silence," she said. Her defiance spread like contagion. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captives again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness. And in that stillness, they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken, control. Official records mention them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else. Living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes deep in the night faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned. And within those forgotten corridors where no sunlight reached, the survivors found something unexpected. An old sealed archway buried in dust and stone. At first, it was a hiding place, but slowly it became something sacred. They used broken pottery for candle holders, a scrap of linen for an altar cloth. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross. In this secret chapel, they gathered each night after the palace slept. April 1241, Western Poland, the most formidable war machine the medieval world had ever known, was about to meet the proudest knights of Christian Europe. What followed over the next 3 days would demolish the illusion of European invincibility and carve a wound into Christendem's memory that would ache for centuries. The Mongols had arrived. To grasp the scale of what was about to unfold, we must first understand who these Mongols really were. They weren't the mindless savages that frightened European scribes later described. They were heirs to Genghis Khan's revolutionary system of warfare, a disciplined engine of conquest that had stretched its reach from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe in less than 2 generations. Every Mongol warrior was born in the saddle, riding before he could properly walk. He could hit a target with his bow while galloping at full speed, survive on maize milk and dried meat for weeks, and cover distances that no European force could imagine. By 1241, the Mongol Empire spanned from China's coast to the very doorstep of Europe. The mighty cities of Central Asia had fallen, and the great powers of the Islamic world had been broken. Even China's Great Wall, the so-called barrier against the north, had failed miserably. Now, under the leadership of Bata Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, 3 Tums, about 30,000 of the most efficient soldiers on earth, had already annihilated Kiev, the jewel of the Rus, and swept through Hungary like wildfire. This invasion was not random plundering. It was a meticulously planned campaign. Batu divided his forces. One army ravaged Hungary while another marched into Poland, eliminating every possible threat to their flanks. They had already torched Lublin, looted Sandomir, and left Kalisz smoldering in ruins. Their next target, Silesia, one of Poland's richest duchies. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious, for his deep faith, understood what was coming. He wasn't naive. Distressing reports had poured in from the east. Whole cities burned to ash in a single day. Populations slaughtered to the last soul. Veteran armies erased within hours. Witnesses called them demons on horseback. Fighters who appeared from nowhere and vanished like ghosts. Yet Henry refused to flee. He was an experienced commander and knew that if the Mongols were not stopped here, Europe itself would lie exposed. He sent desperate pleas across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was staggering. The Knights Templar, legendary veterans of the Crusades, answered his call. The Teutonic Knights rode down from the Baltic, their heavy cavalry armored in black and white. Polish nobles set aside their rivalries and rallied their men. Duke Mesko of Ole brought his full host. Moravian infantry marched north. Even miners from Silesia, men who had never seen battle, took up arms to defend their faith. Terrified chroniclers later claimed that 100,000 men gathered to resist the Mongols. Modern historians comparing logistics and population records suggest a more realistic number of 25 to 40,000. Still one of the largest European forces of the medieval age. For comparison, William the Conqueror had taken England with barely 10,000 men, and the Crusaders' mightiest armies rarely topped 30,000. Opposing them stood around 20,000 Mongols. 2 Tums under Bahar and Khatun. The Europeans outnumbered them, wore heavier armor, wielded superior steel, and marched under the Pope's blessing. They believed God was with them. They would soon learn it wasn't enough. Ba, grandson of Genghis Khan, and Khatun, son of Orgadai, were no savages, but masters of strategy, men trained from birth in the science of war. The Mongols had spent years studying European warfare through spies disguised as traders. They knew every strength and weakness of their foes. The European knight was the tank of his time. A man, a horse, and a mountain of steel capable of smashing infantry lines apart. But the Mongols understood their flaws. Knights were slow, their mounts quickly exhausted, and their desire for glory made them reckless. Most crucially, they fought best in close combat. While Mongol warfare was about killing the enemy before he could even reach you. April 7, 1241, Day 1. The European army advanced from Lenica in traditional formation. A vision that would stir any medieval heart. In the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights clad in chain and early plate armor, helmets glinting in the sun, lances raised high. Each set of armor cost what an entire village might earn in a year. Their war horses, huge destriers bred for power, snorted and poured at the earth, ready to charge. On the flanks marched Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and Silesian miners wielding crude tools turned into weapons. Priests walked among them, offering blessings and absolution. Banners rippled across the field. The black cross of the Teutonic Order, the red of the Templars, the white eagle of Poland. It was the combined strength of Christian Europe made flesh. Then on the horizon, dust. Not the heavy dust of a marching host, but a lighter, restless haze that moved unnaturally fast. The first Mongol scouts appeared, small figures on small, wiry horses. The knights laughed. These were the dreaded Mongols, tiny men on half-sized mounts. Surely they could be crushed in a single charge. The Mongols rode closer, but not too close. They stopped just within their bow range, far beyond that of the Europeans. The Mongol composite bow, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, could strike targets with lethal accuracy at over 350 m, far beyond the reach of any European crossbow. Their riders loosed their arrows high into the sky, then wheeled their horses and sped away. "Cowards!" shouted the Polish knights. "They flee like rabbits, like women." But fleeing was the plan. It wasn't fear. It was doctrine. For hours, waves of Mongol horse archers tormented the European lines. They would gallop in, unleash volleys of arrows, and retreat before the heavy cavalry could respond. Each warrior carried roughly 60 arrows with pack horses trailing behind, loaded with hundreds more. 20,000 men times 60 arrows over 1,000,000 projectiles. The mathematics of death. The Europeans raised shields and endured, but mentally it was breaking them. These knights had trained their whole lives for gallant charges and sword-to-sword glory, not to stand helpless as invisible enemies bled them dry from afar. Horses screamed as shafts found the gaps in their armor. Men cursed as arrows pierced mail at the joints. The unarmored infantry suffered the worst. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to return fire, but by the time they cranked and aimed, the Mongols had already slipped back out of range. The Templars begged permission to charge, but Henry refused. He knew too well what that meant. The Mongols wanted his men to break formation, to chase ghosts and die in pieces. Yet holding ground while being slowly torn apart was just as deadly to morale. By sunset, the true terror of Mongol warfare had revealed itself. This would not be a duel of honor. It was systematic extermination. When night fell, hundreds of Europeans lay dead or groaning on the ground. Horses had to be killed to end their suffering. The camp echoed with the screams of the wounded. The Mongols, they'd lost perhaps a dozen men, a few hit by lucky crossbow bolts. As darkness fell, they made camp just beyond sight. Their signal fires dotted the horizon like fallen stars. And then the drums began. A deep rhythmic thunder rolling through the night, pounding on exhausted European nerves, denying them sleep. Day 2, April 8, 1241. The dawn sky burned red. An omen even the priests struggled to dismiss. The Europeans, sleepless and shaken, reformed their ranks. During the night, many of the wounded had died. Arguments now flared among commanders. Polish nobles bickered with the Templars while the Teutonic Knights demanded an immediate attack. Duke Mesko of OP threatened to pull his men out entirely if they continued to stand idle and be slaughtered like cattle. Henry realized something had to give. When the Mongol riders reappeared that morning, harassing as before, he made a crucial decision. He ordered Duke Mesko to lead a partial cavalry charge. Not the whole force, just enough to drive the horse archers away and perhaps seize a few for questioning. 2,000 of Poland's best knights thundered forward, shaking the earth beneath them. Lances lowered, shields locked. A storm of steel and muscle roared across the plains. The Mongol light cavalry appeared to panic. They turned tail and fled. The Polish knights erupted in triumph. After a day of humiliation, vengeance was at hand. "We have them," Mesko shouted. "Press forward. Glory to Christ. Kill them all." The chase went on for miles, but the Mongols always stayed just out of reach, turning now and then to shoot a few arrows, teasing the pursuit onward. Some Polish nobles began to sense the danger. But Mesko, consumed by fury and pride, pushed his men further. It was exactly what the Mongols had waited for. The feigned retreat, the masterpiece of Mongol warfare, was unfolding to perfection. As the knights became scattered across the plain, their tight formation stretched thin, the trap was sprung. From hidden slopes and hollows, Mongol heavy cavalry, yes, they had heavy units too, erupted in force. At the same time, light cavalry that had been circling unseen closed in from all directions. Mesko understood his mistake too late. His men were surrounded, cut off from Henry's main army, stranded on open ground where their heavy armor offered no advantage. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The Mongols didn't duel for honor. They killed with machine-like precision. They circled the trapped knights, firing volley after volley into the dense mass of men and horses. When the Europeans tried to charge, they met coordinated counterattacks. When they stood still, the arrows rained down without mercy. Only when the survivors were weak and broken did the Mongol heavy cavalry move in for the final blow. Duke Mesko fought bravely. Accounts say he personally struck down a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows pierced his body. His bodyguards made a last stand around him, singing hymns as they died. But the outcome was certain. Of the 2,000 knights who had charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned. The survivors were shattered, some physically wounded, others mentally broken. They spoke of riders who fought like demons, who moved as if of one mind, who killed without mercy and without a word. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died whispering again and again, "They are not men! They are not men!" That night, the Mongols sent a grisly message to Henry's camp. Duke Miesko's severed head packed in salt, accompanied by a single note written in broken Latin. Tomorrow you day 3, April 9th, 1241, the day of annihilation. Henry's war council that morning was a scene of near hysteria. Nearly a quarter of his army was gone. The Moravian infantry were close to mutiny. Several Polish nobles had slipped away in the night with their retinues. Retreat was impossible. Henry knew the Mongols would hunt them down like prey across the plains. There was only one option left: stand and fight, whatever the cost. He chose his battlefield carefully. A rise near the village of Leniki Pole or Lenica Field. The slight elevation gave his archers range, and a stream along one flank would guard against encirclement. Henry arranged his forces in a defensive formation. At the center stood the Templars and Teutonic Knights, men sworn to fight to the death. The Polish knights formed the right wing, the remaining infantry, the left, while Henry held a small reserve behind them. When the morning mist lifted, the Mongols appeared once more. But something looked different. They weren't riding in their usual sweeping formations. Instead, they seemed to be setting up odd-looking devices, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wooden carts. The Europeans stared, confused. Were they cooking, performing some pagan ritual? Then the battle began, and the true horror revealed itself. The cauldrons were Chinese gunpowder smoke generators, not cannons. Those wouldn't appear in Europe for decades. The Mongols had mastered this technology during their campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China. As Henry's army advanced, the Mongols ignited the devices. Thick, choking clouds of black smoke billowed across the field, rolling over the European ranks like a living fog. Within minutes, order disintegrated. Men couldn't see beyond a few feet. Commands were lost in coughing and chaos. Units became separated. Banners vanished into the haze, and with them all coordination. Knights stumbled into their own foot soldiers. Horses panicking in the smoke reared and bolted. Then came the Mongols' most devious trick. Days earlier they had captured Polish prisoners and forced them to learn one short phrase in Polish. Usier strata run. All is lost. Now amid the suffocating smoke, Mongol warriors shouted those same words in perfect imitation. Polish soldiers, unable to see who was shouting, heard what sounded like familiar voices ordering retreat. Panic spread faster than any weapon. Men began running, colliding with comrades who still tried to hold the line. The left wing, the infantry, broke first, fleeing in terror. That collapse exposed the center where the Templars and Teutonic Knights now stood isolated in a sea of confusion. The Mongols struck with terrifying precision. How they maintained coordination in that smoke remains a mystery. Perhaps through drums or horns at low frequencies that carried through the chaos. Or maybe they simply knew their roles so well. Every man moving like part of a single organism. Mongol light cavalry hit the flanks, showering arrows into the disoriented mass. Heavy cavalry slammed into weakened clusters, smashing them apart. The Knights Templar fought with the conviction of men who believed martyrdom awaited them. Surrounded, outnumbered, blinded, they formed a circle and fought until none were left standing. Their grandmaster, Porn Dorbong, was later found with 23 arrows in his body, his sword shattered, lying among heaps of Mongol dead. The Teutonic knights attempted to break free, forming a wedge and charging blindly through the fog. For a brief moment, they broke the Mongol lines, only to find themselves in open country, pursued by mounted archers. One by one they fell, their heavy armor now a death sentence as their exhausted horses collapsed beneath them. From the rear, Duke Henry saw the disaster unfolding and made a desperate choice. He raised his personal banner and rode forward, trying to rally what remained of his army. For a moment, it seemed to work. Scattered knights began converging toward him. Then a single Mongol arrow loosed by an unknown archer found its mark, striking Henry beneath the arm where his armor plates joined. He swayed but did not fall, still swinging his sword. His bodyguards surrounded him, trying to pull him to safety, but the Mongols had spotted the banner. They focused everything on that single point. Henry's guards were cut down one by one. At last, the Duke, bleeding heavily, fell from his horse. Seeing him collapse, the remaining resistance broke completely. The line turned into a rout, then into slaughter. The Mongols pursued the fleeing men for miles, cutting them down as they ran. Knights tore off their armor to escape faster. Proud nobles cried for mercy in languages their killers neither understood nor cared to. Henry was found alive but dying. Following their custom of honoring brave foes, the Mongol commanders offered him a swift, merciful death. He refused, saying he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. They obliged him. His head was struck from his body and mounted on a spear paraded through Legnica as proof of victory. Days later, his mother searched the battlefield among the corpses. She recognized him only by his sixth toe on the left foot. By noon that day, it was over. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. The Mongols, following custom, sliced off the right ear of every fallen enemy to count the dead, filling 9 vast leather sacks. Chroniclers claimed between 10,000 and 25,000 Europeans lay dead upon the field. Virtually the entire nobility of Silesia had been wiped out. The Templars and Teutonic Knights suffered such devastating losses that it would take a generation before their numbers recovered. Entire dynasties that had ruled for centuries were erased in a single morning. Modern historians estimate Mongol losses at fewer than 700 men, most of them from the heavy cavalry that led the final assaults. The battlefield itself looked like something out of hell. Bodies were piled so thick that a man could walk for hundreds of yards without stepping on the ground. Carrion birds darkened the sky, circling so densely they blotted out the sun. The smell of death carried for miles. 4 years afterward, local farmers would still unear bones in their fields. In only 3 days, a smaller Mongol force had completely destroyed one of the largest European armies ever assembled. But the Battle of Lenica was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological one. It broke Europe's sense of invincibility and changed the course of its history. News of the defeat swept across the continent like wildfire. In Paris, King Louis IX ordered new fortifications and reorganized his army with updated tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Europe itself from the so-called horsemen of the devil. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, long at odds with the papacy, suddenly found both sides willing to make peace in the face of this external nightmare. Letters from the time reveal how deeply the terror ran. One German chronicler wrote, "The Mongols are the punishment of God for our sins. They fight not as men do with honor, but as demons with deceit and cruelty. Our knights, the finest in Christendom, were as children before them." The shock went far beyond military loss. The Mongols had proven that the foundation of European power. The armored knight was obsolete against a disciplined, tactically superior enemy. The proud ideals of chivalry, individual heroism, and honor on the battlefield meant nothing against an army that fought with strategy and precision rather than pride. Yet Europe's salvation came from an unexpected twist. In December of 1241, only 8 months after Legica, the great Khan Ogdai died in Mongolia. Some sources say he drank himself to death. Others suggest poisoning. By Mongol law, every prince of Genghis Khan's bloodline was required to return home for the election of a new great Khan, Bata Khan, though frustrated at halting his conquest, obeyed. His armies withdrew and Europe was spared. The Mongols would never again advance this far west. Political infighting, vast distances, and the eventual fragmentation of their empire kept them from returning. But the memory of that defeat was burned into Europe's collective consciousness, written in fire and blood. The Battle of Lenica forced a revolution in military thought. Within a generation, European forces began integrating combined arms tactics, strengthening their archery and experimenting with primitive gunpowder weapons. The age of the mounted knight's supremacy had begun its slow death. Professional armies would replace feudal levies. Discipline and coordination would matter more than noble valor. Some historians argue that Lenica may have saved Europe by forcing these changes early. 2 centuries later, when the Ottoman Turks, heirs to Mongol military traditions, marched into Europe, the continent was ready. It met them not with scattered knights, but with organized armies, firearms, and strategy born from painful lessons learned on that blood-soaked plain. Today, the Battle of Legnica is remembered differently across nations. In Poland, it remains both a tragedy and a source of pride, proof that their ancestors stood defiant against impossible odds. In Mongolia, it is celebrated as one of history's most brilliant tactical victories. Studied by militaries around the world as a masterclass in strategy and discipline, overcoming numbers and technology, the battlefield itself is peaceful farmland. Now, a modest monument marks where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Each year on April 9th, reenactors gather there in armor and chain mail, carrying replica weapons to relive the clash. Yet no reenactment can truly recreate the terror of that smoke-choked morning when the medieval world order collapsed on the plains of Silesia. The echo of Mongol hooves still resounds through history, a chilling reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, stands immune to sudden collapse. At Legica, the Mongols did not merely defeat an army. They destroyed an entire worldview. They ended an age and forced a civilization to evolve or perish. All of it in just 3 days. 3 days that changed the world forever.